You've got this. I've seen you practice this speech 100 times while I cleaned around you. Your words will change lives today. These were the last words whispered by Maria Santos, a single mother working as a night janitor, to a trembling young man backstage at what she thought was just another corporate presentation. She had no idea that beyond those heavy curtains, 200 world leaders from every nation on Earth were waiting to hear the most important speech about climate change in human history. Before we continue, if you enjoy inspiring real life, stories that show how ordinary people create extraordinary moments, make sure to click that subscribe button. This is the best way for you to support our work. Thank you very much, and let's continue. Dr. James Chen stood frozen behind the massive velvet curtains of the United Nations General Assembly Hall, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold his speech notes. At 28, he was the youngest person ever invited to present at the UN Climate Summit, but right now, that felt more like a curse than an honor. The weight of 3 years of groundbreaking research on ocean acidification sat heavy in his briefcase, research that could potentially save millions of coastal communities from rising sea levels. Yet all he could think about was the 200, pairs of eyes that would soon be staring at him, judging every word, every pause, every breath. The irony wasn't lost on him that someone who had spent his entire adult life studying the ocean's depths was now drowning in his own anxiety. His breakthrough discovery about coral reef regeneration through bioengineered algae could revolutionize how the world approached climate change. But none of that mattered if he couldn't get the words out of his mouth. He had practiced this speech countless times in his lab, in his apartment, even in the shower, but now, standing here in the heart of global diplomacy, every word seemed to have evaporated from his memory. James closed his eyes and tried to remember how he had gotten to this moment. It had started with a simple observation during his doctoral research at Stanford. While diving in the Maldives, he noticed that certain coral reefs were not just surviving the warming waters, but actually thriving. Most scientists attributed this to genetic adaptation, but James saw something different. The water around these reefs had a unique composition of algae that seemed to create a protective barrier against acid damage. It took him 2 years of laboratory work to isolate the specific algae strains and another year to develop a method for cultivating them on a massive scale. The implications were staggering. If his research was correct, they could potentially restore damaged coral reefs within 5 years instead of 50. This wasn't just about saving fish or creating pretty underwater landscapes for tourists. Coral reefs protected over 200 million people from storm surges and provided protein for 500 million more. His research could literally save lives, entire island nations, complete ecosystems. But first, he had to convince the world's leaders to fund a global implementation program, and right now, he couldn't even convince himself that he could speak without vomiting. The backstage area of the UN General Assembly was a maze of cables, equipment, and nervous energy. Security personnel moved with quiet efficiency, checking credentials and monitoring every corner. Translators huddled over their notes, preparing to convert James's words into dozens of languages simultaneously. Camera operators adjusted their equipment for the live global broadcast that would reach an estimated 50 million viewers. The gravity of the moment pressed down on everyone present. But nobody felt it more acutely than the young marine biologist who was about to either make history or humiliate himself in front of the entire world. James tried the breathing exercises his therapist had taught him, but they only seemed to make his heart race faster. He attempted to review his notes one more time, but the words blurred together on the page like ink in water. His mind raced through every possible way this could go wrong. What if he forgot his key points? What if the world leaders found his research unconvincing? What if his accent was too thick for the translators? What if he tripped walking to the podium? Each thought spiraled into the next, creating a cascade of anxiety that threatened to overwhelm him completely. That's when he heard the soft footsteps approaching from behind. James turned to see a woman in her early 40s pushing a cleanings cart. Her black hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing the simple gray uniform of the building's maintenance staff. She had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to navigate the world without drawing attention to herself. Maria Santos had been cleaning the UN building for 3 years, working the night shift so she could be home when her 12-year-old daughter Isabella got back from school. Maria had seen this young man many times over the past week. He would arrive early in the morning, long before his scheduled practice sessions, and stay late into the evening, rehearsing his presentation to empty chairs. She had watched him from the corners of conference rooms as she dusted and vacuumed, had seen the passion in his eyes when he spoke about coral reefs and ocean chemistry. She had also noticed how his confidence seemed to crumble every time he thought about the actual presentation day. "Excuse me," Maria said softly, her slight Mexican accent giving warmth to her words. "I don't mean to interrupt, but I couldn't help noticing you seem nervous." James looked up, startled. In his anxiety-fueled tunnel vision, he had barely registered the cleaning staff moving around the building all week. "Oh, I'm sorry. Am I in your way? I can move." No, Maria smiled, parking her cart to the side. "You're not in my way at all. I've been working here long enough to recognize the look of someone about to give an important presentation. My name is Maria." "James," he replied, attempting a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "And yes, I suppose I am a bit nervous. I'm giving a speech today about my research." Maria studied his face for a moment, seeing not just the nervous energy, but the deep exhaustion underneath. This young man had clearly been pushing himself to his limits, probably forgetting to eat or sleep properly. She recognized the signs because she had lived them herself, working multiple jobs while putting herself through community college, raising Isabella alone, always carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. "You know," Maria said, settling into a nearby chair as if she had all the time in the world. "I've been cleaning around here for 3 years, and I've seen a lot of important people give a lot of important speeches, but I've been watching you practice all week, and I can tell you something about your presentation that you might not realize." James found himself genuinely curious, despite his anxiety. There was something calming about Maria's presence, a grounded quality that made him feel less like he was floating in space and more like he was connected to solid ground. "When you talk about your coral reefs," Maria continued, "your whole face lights up. You don't just speak about science, you speak about hope. You talk about saving islands and protecting families, about giving children a future where they don't have to leave their homes because the ocean swallowed them up. That's not just research. Me, Joe, that's love." The endearment caught James off guard. When was the last time anyone had called him anything other than Dr. Chen or Professor? When was the last time someone had looked at him and seen not just his credentials, but his heart? "Grew up in a small coastal town in Mexico," Maria continued, her voice taking on a distant quality as she remembered. "My grandmother used to tell me stories about when the reefs were so beautiful and full of life that fishermen could feed their families with just a few hours of work. By the time I was a teenager, those same fishermen were going out for entire days and coming back with almost nothing. That's when I knew I had to leave. Had to find a way to give my daughter opportunities I never had." James listened, struck by the realization that his research wasn't just about abstract scientific concepts. It was about real people like Maria, like her grandmother, like her daughter. It was about families who had been forced to leave their homes, communities that had lost their livelihoods, children who might never see the ocean's beauty that previous generations had taken for granted. "The thing is," Maria said, leaning forward slightly, "I can tell you care about those families just as much as you care about the science. When you practice your speech, you don't just talk about algae and pH levels, you talk about hope. You talk about bringing life back to places where life was dying. That's a beautiful thing, James. That's something worth sharing with the world." For the first time in days, James felt his shoulders relax slightly. "But what if they don't understand? What if the research isn't convincing enough? What if I can't explain it properly?" Maria smiled, and there was something almost maternal in her expression. "Let me tell you something I learned when I was studying for my citizenship test while working 3 jobs and raising Isabella. The people who matter, the people who can actually help you make a difference, they're not looking for perfect presentations. They're looking for real solutions from real people who care enough to fight for them." She stood up and walked over to where James was sitting, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You've spent 3 years of your life working on this research, not because someone told you to, but because you saw a problem that needed solving. You've run experiments until your eyes hurt. You've spent your own money on equipment. You've probably missed dinners and parties and sleep because you believed this work mattered. That kind of dedication, that kind of love for what you do, that's what they need to see." James felt tears welling up in his eyes, not from anxiety this time, but from a deep sense of being understood. For so long, he had been focused on the technical aspects of his presentation, on impressing his peers and proving his scientific credentials. He had forgotten that at the heart of his research was a simple desire to protect the planet's most vulnerable communities. "You know what I do when Isabella has to give a presentation at school?" Maria asked, her voice gentle but strong. "I tell her to remember why she chose her topic in the first place. Not because the teacher assigned it, but what made her curious about it, what made her care. When you remember why you care, the words come naturally." The conversation was interrupted by a production assistant calling out that they needed Dr. Chen for final sound checks in 10 minutes. The reality of the situation came rushing back, but somehow the panic felt more manageable. "Now, I should let you get back to work," James said, standing up. "Thank you for taking the time to talk with me. I know you probably have other things to do." Maria laughed softly. "Other things to do? Like what, mop the same floor for the 3rd time today? Trust me, Talking with someone who's about to change the world is much more interesting than cleaning supply closets. As she picked up her cleaning supplies, Maria turned back to James one more time. You know, there's something I want you to remember when you're up there. Every person in that audience, no matter how important they seem, they all have families they want to protect, communities they care about, futures they're worried about. You're not talking to world leaders, you're talking to parents and grandparents. And people who stay awake at night wondering what kind of planet they're leaving behind. Speak to that part of them and they'll listen. The 10-minute warning came again, more urgent this time. James gathered his notes and briefcase, but before heading toward the stage entrance, he turned back to Maria. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "What do you hope for your daughter's future?" Maria's eyes softened as she thought about Isabella. "I hope she grows up in a world where the ocean is still beautiful, where islands don't disappear under the waves, where children can learn about coral reefs by seeing them, not just by reading about them in history books. I hope she lives in a world where problems like climate change are solved by people who care enough to spend their lives looking for answers." She paused, then added with a knowing smile, "I hope she lives in a world shaped by people like you." With those words echoing in his mind, James walked toward the stage entrance. The production assistant clipped a wireless microphone to his jacket and ran through the final technical checks. The stage manager gave him the 2-minute warning, and James found himself standing in the wings, looking out at the massive assembly hall filled with delegates from every nation on Earth. But as he stood there, instead of seeing intimidating world leaders and judging faces, he began to see something different. He saw Maria's grandmother telling stories about abundant reefs. He saw Isabella dreaming of a future where the ocean still teemed with life. He saw the fishermen from Maria's hometown, hoping for waters that could sustain their families again. He saw children on island nations, playing on beaches that wouldn't exist in 50 years unless something changed today. The Secretary General's voice boomed across the assembly hall as she began his introduction. "Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished delegates, it is my honor to present Dr. James Chen, whose groundbreaking research on coral reef regeneration represents one of the most promising developments in our fight against climate change." James closed his eyes and took one final deep breath. When he opened them, he could almost feel Maria's presence, even though she was probably 3 floors down, emptying trash cans and restocking paper towels. Her words echoed in his mind. "You've got this. I've seen you practice this speech 100 times while I cleaned around you. Your words will change lives today." The applause began as his name was called, and James Chen walked out onto the stage of the United Nations General Assembly. The spotlights were blinding at first, but as his eyes adjusted, he could see the faces in the audience. Some looked skeptical, others appeared bored, a few seemed genuinely interested. But instead of letting their expressions intimidate him, James remembered Maria's advice. These weren't just world leaders, they were people with families and fears and hopes for the future. He approached the podium, set down his notes, and looked out at the assembly. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then, instead of launching into his prepared opening about marine biology and ocean chemistry, James began with something completely different. 3 days ago, I met a woman named Maria, who told me about her grandmother's stories of coral reefs so beautiful and abundant that fishermen could feed their families with just a few hours of work. His voice was steady now, filled with the passion Maria had recognized. Today, those same reefs are dying. Those fishermen struggle to catch enough to survive. And families like Maria's have been forced to leave their homes, searching for opportunities that climate change has stolen from their communities. The assembly hall had grown completely quiet. Even the translators seemed to lean forward, eager to capture every word for the global audience. "But I'm not here today to talk about loss," James continued, his confidence building with each sentence. "I'm here to talk about hope. I'm here to talk about a discovery that could restore those reefs, rebuild those communities, and give children like Maria's daughter, Isabella, a future where the ocean is alive again." As James launched into his presentation 3 floors below, Maria Santos continued her work, unaware that the young man she had encouraged was addressing the entire world. She had no idea that his words were being broadcast live to 50 million viewers, or that the Secretary General herself was taking notes, or that representatives from 12 different countries were already discussing funding mechanisms on their phones. Maria simply went about her work, restocking supplies and emptying wastebaskets, carrying with her the quiet satisfaction of having helped a nervous young researcher find his voice. She thought about Isabella, probably just getting home from school, and smiled at the thought of helping her with homework later that evening. She thought about the weekend, when they would visit the small community garden where Isabella was growing tomatoes for a school project. Meanwhile, in the assembly hall, James was explaining the technical aspects of his algae cultivation process. But he was doing it in terms that resonated with parents and grandparents, with people who understood that science meant nothing if it couldn't improve real lives. He spoke about coral reefs, not just as ecosystems, but as protective barriers for island communities. He discussed his research not just as a breakthrough in marine biology, but as a tool for economic recovery in coastal regions devastated by climate change. The presentation that James had agonized over for weeks now flowed naturally, each point. Building on the last, each scientific concept grounded in human impact. He showed photographs of dying reefs, but followed them with images of restored coral gardens from his pilot programs. He presented data on ocean acidification, but explained it in terms of lost livelihoods and displaced families. Most importantly, he painted a vision of what the world could look like if his research was implemented globally. The question before us today is not whether we can save the world's coral reefs, James said as he approached his conclusion. The science shows us that we can. The question is whether we have the will to invest in hope over despair, in solutions over resignation, in the future over the past. He paused, looking out at faces that now showed not skepticism, but genuine engagement. 3 years ago, I began this research because I couldn't accept that the ocean's most beautiful and productive ecosystems were condemned to die. Today, I'm asking you to share that refusal to accept defeat. I'm asking you to invest in a future where children can learn about coral reefs by swimming above them, not by reading about them in textbooks about extinction. The applause began before James had even finished his final sentence, starting with a few delegates and quickly spreading throughout the assembly hall. As he gathered his notes and stepped back from the podium, James felt a profound sense of completion, not just of his presentation, but of a journey that had begun with a simple observation in the waters off the Maldives and now culminated in front of the world's most powerful leaders. The Secretary General returned to the podium as the applause died down. Dr. Chen, on behalf of the United Nations and all member nations, I want to thank you for sharing your groundbreaking research with us today. I understand there are already several delegates who would like to discuss potential funding partnerships with you immediately following this session. As James made his way backstage, he was surrounded by representatives from various countries, environmental organizations, and research institutions. The Canadian delegate wanted to discuss implementation in the Arctic. The president of the Maldives wanted to schedule a meeting about emergency reef restoration. A representative from the World Bank was talking about a multi-billion-dollar global fund. But even as James found himself in the center of this whirlwind of interest and opportunity, part of his mind kept returning to Maria's words. Her quiet confidence had transformed his paralyzing anxiety into purposeful passion. Her simple reminder that science meant nothing without heart had changed not just his presentation, but his entire understanding of his role as a researcher. It wasn't until several hours later, after countless meetings and interviews and photo opportunities, that James finally had a chance to seek out the woman who had made it all possible. He found Maria in a supply closet on the 3rd floor, organizing cleaning products with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything she did. "Maria," he called softly, not wanting to startle her. She turned around, surprised to see him. "James, how did your presentation go? I hope it went well." James laughed, suddenly realizing the absurdity of the situation. "Maria, do you know what happened up there today?" She shook her head, genuinely puzzled. "I assumed it was some kind of corporate conference. Was it important?" "Maria," James said, his voice filled with amazement, "that was the United Nations General Assembly. I just presented my research to world leaders from every nation on Earth. It was broadcast live to 50 million people, and 12 countries have already committed to funding global implementation of my coral reef restoration program." Maria's eyes widened as the reality of the situation began to sink in. "The United Nations? You mean, like, world peace and climate change and all? That? Exactly like that," James nodded. "And it's all because of what you told me backstage. You helped me remember why I started this research in the first place. You helped me find my voice." For a moment, Maria was speechless. Then, typically, she deflected attention away from herself. "I didn't do anything special. You had everything you needed inside you already. You just needed someone to remind you." "No," James said firmly. "What you did was special. What you said about speaking to the part of people that cares about their families and communities, about remembering why I care about this work, that changed everything. You didn't just help me give a better presentation, you helped me understand what it means to be a scientist in service of humanity." Maria smiled, but James could see that she was still processing the magnitude of what had happened. "Does this mean your coral reef project will actually happen? Like, for real?" "For real," James confirmed. "We're looking at a $15 billion international program to restore coral reefs worldwide. It will create jobs in coastal communities, protect millions of people from storm surges, and restore marine ecosystems that support 500 million people. Your grandmother's stories about abundant reefs? Isabella might get to live those stories instead of just hearing about them." Tears began to form in Maria's eyes as she thought about what this could mean for communities like the one she had left behind in Mexico, for families like hers who had been forced to leave their homes because climate change had destroyed their livelihoods. There's something else, James continued. The UN wants to create a community liaison program as part of the Coral Reef Initiative. They need someone who understands both the science and the human impact, someone who can help connect researchers with the communities we're trying to serve. I recommended you for the position. Maria stared at him in shock. Me? But I'm just a janitor. I don't have any qualifications for something like that. You have the most important qualification there is, James replied. You understand that science means nothing if it doesn't improve people's lives. You helped a terrified researcher remember his purpose and find his voice. You've raised a daughter while working multiple jobs and studying for your citizenship. You've lived the experience of climate displacement while never losing hope for the future. The UN doesn't need another person with degrees, Maria. They need someone with heart. The supply closet fell silent as Maria absorbed what James was telling her. After years of cleaning offices and emptying trash cans, after countless nights studying English and citizenship materials while Isabella slept, after all the sacrifices and struggles and small victories that had brought her to this moment, she was being offered a chance to be part of something that could change the world. What would I have to do? She asked quietly. Help communities understand how the coral restoration program would work in their specific areas. Help researchers like me understand what these communities really need. Make sure that when we talk about saving coral reefs, we're also talking about saving the people who depend on them. Be the bridge between the science and the human reality. Maria thought about Isabella, about the future she wanted for her daughter. She thought about her grandmother's stories of abundant reefs. She thought about all the families who had been forced to leave their homes because the ocean could no longer sustain them. And she thought about the conversation she had had with James just a few hours earlier, when she had encouraged him to remember why his work mattered. Would I be able to help families like mine? She asked. Families who lost their homes because of climate change? That would be the whole point, James said. This program isn't just about saving coral reefs. It's about restoring the communities that depend on them. It's about giving people like your grandmother's neighbors a reason to stay home instead of being forced to leave. Maria took a deep breath, and James could see the moment when uncertainty transformed into determination. When would I start? The program officially launches in 6 months, but we need to begin community outreach immediately. There would be training, travel to project sites, coordination with international teams. It's a big job, Maria. But then again, you've been handling big jobs your whole life. As they talked about the details of the position, both James and Maria began to understand that this moment represented more than just a career opportunity or even a successful research presentation. It represented the power of human connection to transform individual struggles into collective solutions, the way that one person's encouragement could ripple outward to change the world. 3 months later, James stood on a boat off the coast of the Maldives, watching as the first large-scale implementation of his algae cultivation program began. Divers were carefully installing the bioengineered algae systems around a reef that had been declared dead just 2 years earlier. Early monitoring data suggested that the coral was already beginning to show signs of recovery. On the boat with him was Maria, now serving as the UN's Director of Community Relations for the Global Coral Restoration Initiative. She had spent the past month meeting with local fishermen, learning about their traditional knowledge of reef systems, and helping to design an implementation plan that would provide immediate economic benefits to the community while the long-term restoration work proceeded. Isabella would love this, Maria said, watching the divers work below. She was thinking about her daughter, who was now involved in a pen pal program with children from island communities around the world, sharing stories and dreams about ocean conservation. She's going to see a lot more of it, James replied. The Australian site launches next month, then the Caribbean sites, then the Pacific Islands. By the time she graduates high school, there will be coral restoration projects on every continent. Maria smiled, thinking about how much had changed since that morning in the UN building when she had encountered a nervous young researcher backstage. Do you ever think about how different things might have been if we hadn't talked that day? James considered the question seriously. I think I would have given the presentation eventually. I was too invested in the research to give up completely, but I don't think it would have had the same impact. Without your reminder to speak from the heart, I would have focused on the technical details and missed the human connection. The delegates might have been impressed by the science, but they wouldn't have been moved to act. And I would still be cleaning supply closets, Maria added, not with bitterness, but with amazement at how quickly life could change. Nothing wrong with cleaning supply closets, James said. Honest work that keeps the world functioning. But this work changes the world. As the boat headed back to shore, both James and Maria reflected on the chain of events that had brought them to this moment. A chance encounter between a nervous scientist and a compassionate janitor had become a global initiative that would affect millions of lives. It was a reminder that the most important conversations often happen in unexpected places between unlikely people, at moments when one person's vulnerability meets another person's wisdom. The coral restoration program would go on to exceed all expectations. Within 5 years, reef systems that had been declared dead were showing signs of vibrant life. Coastal communities that had been devastated by climate change were rebuilding. Their economies around sustainable fishing and ecotourism. Children who had never seen healthy coral reefs were learning to dive in waters that teemed with colorful marine life. But perhaps more importantly, the program became a model for how scientific research could be grounded in human compassion, how individual moments of kindness could scale up to global solutions, and how the most profound changes often begin with the simplest acts of encouragement. James continued his research, but his approach was forever changed by Maria's influence. He never again presented his work without first considering how it would affect real families, real communities, real children dreaming of their futures. His laboratory became a place where scientists from around the world came not just to study marine biology, but to learn how to connect their research to human needs. Maria thrived in her role at the UN, becoming a respected voice for community-centered environmental policy. She helped establish protocols ensuring that climate change solutions always considered the needs of the people most affected by environmental degradation. Her work influenced programs far beyond coral reef restoration, from renewable energy initiatives to sustainable agriculture projects. And Isabella grew up with a front-row seat to history, watching her mother help heal the planet while learning that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they combined scientific knowledge with human compassion. She would go on to study marine biology herself, inspired by both James's research and her mother's example of turning care into action. Years later, when James was asked to speak at universities about his breakthrough discovery, he would always tell the story of Maria Santos, the janitor who helped him find his voice. And when Maria was invited to speak at international conferences about community engagement in environmental policy, she would always emphasize that her most important contribution had been a simple reminder to a nervous young man that science meant nothing without heart. Their story became a testament to the power of human connection, the importance of approaching challenges with both intelligence and compassion, and the extraordinary results that could emerge when people supported each other through moments of doubt and fear. It was a reminder that changing the world often begins with changing a single moment, one conversation at a time.